The king of late night froze solid. Minutes before the show went live, a cheap wooden harmonica caused Johnny Carson to suffer a full, terrifying breakdown at his desk, trapping him inside a 27-year-old trauma. This is the untold story of how his closest friend, Doc Severinsen, defied panicking producers and invented a secret 12-word code to save the show and protect his star's dignity. Ed McMahon, who had shared the stage with Johnny for nearly 3 decades, looked up from his notes, initially confused, then horrified. Ed knew comedy was often about timing, but this was a break that stretched too long, a vacuum where confidence should have been. "Johnny?" Ed asked softly, his booming voice hushed by confusion. He glanced nervously at the audience seating. Though empty for rehearsal, the presence of the impending live crowd felt palpable. Fred de Cordova, always the pragmatist, rushed toward the desk, his clipboard held like a shield against the unexpected crisis. "Johnny, we start in 20 minutes, Fred hissed, his voice hushed with panic. "It's just a joke. Play the riff. What's wrong?" But Johnny couldn't respond. He didn't even blink. He was locked inside the memory triggered by that worn piece of wood, trapped behind a barrier of cold terror. The contrast between his polished tuxedo and the utter desolation in his eyes was stark. The man who had built an entire career on unflappable control was entirely out of control, physically rigid, emotionally naked. The entire crew, the stagehands, the boom operators, the cameramen, all sensed the gravity of the situation and froze. Fred de Cordova, his face slick with sweat, pointed a trembling finger at a nearby cameraman, silently miming a movement cue to distract the host. The cameraman, a veteran named Gary, simply kept his lens fixed on Johnny's desk, his eyes conveying a clear refusal. The star was in danger, and they would not participate in corporate optics. They had seen Johnny be angry, tired, or disappointed, but never broken. Their jobs depended entirely on his competence, and watching their bedrock suddenly crumble was professionally terrifying. The collective silence of Studio One, usually bustling with activity minutes before airtime, was oppressive, amplifying the ticking clock that pointed relentlessly toward 11:30 p.m. Fred reached out to touch Johnny's arm, a violation of the unspoken rule that defined the professional space around the star. Before his hand could make contact, Johnny violently recoiled, a rapid, defensive jerk that knocked over a cup of water, sending a dark, spreading stain across the polished desk. It was an instinctive, animalistic reaction of a man protecting a profound wound. The small sound of the water splashing confirmed the disaster. The rehearsal was officially over, replaced by a crisis only a handful of people would ever know about. Ed, recognizing the depth of the distress, finally rose from his chair, his expression one of profound concern. The silence of the studio was now electric, fraught with 20 million unseen expectations, and the knowledge that one of the biggest television shows in the world was moments away from broadcasting on an empty stage. Something massive had to happen, and it had to happen now. Doc Severinsen, standing across the stage, was the only one who seemed to understand that only a massive distraction could save the show from the complete collapse of its king. The terrible silence of Johnny's collapse was shattered, not by the panicked whisper of a producer, but by an unexpected, ear-splitting blast of the trumpet, a sound so immediate and aggressive it seemed to physically push the tension out of the room. Doc Severinsen, with his trademark vigor, had taken immediate, decisive, and entirely unauthorized action. He did not rush to Johnny's side, which would have confirmed the crisis. Instead, he grabbed his silver trumpet and, without pausing for thought, launched into a bizarre, chaotic, yet technically brilliant piece of improvised jazz. The notes were loud, angular, and nonsensical, a full-bore musical assault that drowned out Fred de Cordova's frantic whispers and the horrified stillness of the crew. Doc was creating noise to cover the terrifying vacuum, confusing Johnny's paralysis into a moment of intentional, staged chaos. The producers and crew, momentarily stunned by the auditory disruption, were unsure whether this was an emergency or some bizarre, new, unscripted opening bit. Doc used the music not just to distract but to command. Through the frantic improvisational structure, he played distinct, specific note patterns, a series of deep, sustained brass chords that only the veteran crew members would recognize as a nonverbal signal. Technical hold. Clear the stage. Do not engage the host. He was orchestrating a rescue using only rhythm and melody. Fred de Cordova, recovering from the shock, lunged toward the bandstand, furious. "Doc! What in God's name are you doing? Shut that off. We have a crisis." But the music was too loud, too insistent. Doc simply closed his eyes and blew harder, sustaining the illusion of controlled chaos. The brilliant, dissonant piece served its immediate purpose. It forced everyone, including the paralyzed Ed McMahon, to focus on the stage's most commanding presence, the band leader, instead of the utterly exposed man gripping the desk. Under the cover of the musical noise, two stagehands, taking their cue from the deep notes, discreetly approached Johnny from behind, treating him as though he were a faulty piece of scenery. They gently shielded him from view, moving slowly to guide him away from the camera line. Doc watched this maneuver, still blasting his trumpet, playing a triumphant, mocking fanfare as Johnny was escorted slowly off stage. He was playing for Johnny's dignity, buying the star the most precious commodity in television: unobserved time. He played until the host was safely out of sight, then, with a final, screeching crescendo, he stopped. The silence that followed was still tense, but the immediate panic had subsided. The crisis had been transformed, publicly, into a strange, unexplained technical delay. Doc stepped forward and took a dramatic, over-the-top bow, smiling falsely at the empty seats, feigning an explanation for the unexpected pause. He had saved the moment, but the cost was the realization that the wound that caused Johnny's collapse was deep, serious, and rooted in a history only Doc understood. The vibrant music had covered the failure, but only the truth could heal the profound, crippling fear that had just shut down the king. The freezing chaos of the studio vanished from Johnny's mind, replaced by the suffocating smell of cheap theatrical dust and stale cigarette smoke from 27 years ago, transporting him back to the devastating moment the harmonica first betrayed him. It was a bleak November night in 1956, and the venue was a drafty, third-rate theater in Des Moines, Iowa, far from the bright lights of Burbank. Johnny, then barely known, was performing a self-written routine, pouring every ounce of his ambition into a show he desperately hoped would secure the down payment on his first small house for his young family. His primary prop was that same cheap wooden harmonica, intended to be a sentimental callback to his humble Nebraska roots. He had bought it for 75 cents from a pawn shop, believing it symbolized authenticity, a touch of the common man he was trying to represent. The prop was vital. It was supposed to provide the emotional anchor for a heartfelt closing joke about never forgetting where you came from. He even wore a custom-made, slightly oversized suit, a symbol of the success he was trying to claim. But on that night, as the curtain rose, the sound that emerged from the harmonica was not the warm, nostalgic sound he intended. It was a screech, a thin, pathetic noise that instantly halted the laughter. Waiting in the audience was Harold Grimes, the most feared and cynical critic for the Des Moines Register. Grimes, known for his ability to end careers with a single sentence, watched with merciless boredom. As Johnny stammered through the rest of the routine, Grimes scribbled furiously, his pen scratching loudly on his notepad, an auditory judgment in the tense silence. He didn't just walk out, he ostentatiously folded his leather notepad, looked directly at the stage, and slowly walked out before the encore, ensuring Johnny saw the gesture of utter contempt. The review, published the next morning, was brutal, taking up nearly half a page. Grimes didn't just dismiss the entire act as cheap Midwest sentimentality, delivered with the panicked sweat of a man who knows he's going nowhere. He used the review to dismantle Johnny's core philosophy, ridiculing the idea of using humble props and homespun charm. Grimes wrote that Carson was a man who tried to fake sincerity but lacked the backbone to be truly dramatic. The only honest thing about the show was the pathetic, whining sound of the broken-mouth harp, a fitting instrument for a performer who is completely out of tune with his own ambition, the review stated with cutting finality. That review didn't just critique the act, it dismantled Johnny's very character. It attacked his ambition, his past, and his fear, and the humiliation was absolute. The show was canceled the next day. The dream of the house dissolved, replaced by overwhelming self-doubt. That singular failure planted the seed of professional paranoia that dictated his life. Never show sentiment, never show weakness, never ever rely on anything that could be labeled cheap Midwest sentimentality. The King of Late Night was born that day, built on a fortress of cynicism and ironclad control, all stemming from the betrayal of that little harmonica. He vowed never again to put his own unguarded emotion on display for public judgment. In the orchestra pit that night, playing saxophone for the pathetic house band, was a young, struggling musician named Doc Severinsen. Doc had watched the humiliation unfold. He saw the sweat dripping from Johnny's brow and the flicker of devastation in his eyes when the note squeaked. While the rest of the band snickered at Carson's despair in the wings, Doc was silent, tuning his instrument with grim concentration. He saw not a failed comedian, but a man experiencing a crushing personal defeat. Later, in the freezing, stinking alley outside the theater, where Johnny stood alone, shattered, holding the cursed harmonica and the crumpled, savage review, Doc walked past. He stopped 50 feet away. He didn't offer pity or advice. He didn't speak a single word. He just nodded once, a deep, slow movement of his head that conveyed, "I saw it. I know it wasn't your fault. I know what they did to you. And I won't tell anyone." That silent, respectful acknowledgement was the start of an unbreakable bond, a foundation of professional loyalty, built not on success but on shared, agonizing failure. What Doc saw was the complete dismantling of a person's hope, the kind of soul-crushing moment that defines a career. That silent respect, that one nod, signaled a permanent, unspoken understanding. We musicians, we are the support structure. We keep the true self hidden. It was a pact forged in failure, guaranteeing Doc would never use Johnny's past against him. Johnny never forgot that Doc had witnessed his greatest, most vulnerable shame and had offered silent, unwavering respect instead of mockery. Now, 27 years later, the same cheap wooden prop had brought the King of Late Night back to that Iowa alley, proving the wound had never truly healed and the pact remained sacred. If you believe loyalty is more important than ratings, hit that subscribe button and follow the rest of this story to see the radical steps Johnny takes to protect his friend's dignity. The momentary relief of the music was instantly replaced by the terrifying, echoing silence of the main hall, amplifying the urgency as Carson was half carried, half rushed to his private sanctuary. The moment Johnny vanished through the steel-reinforced door of his dressing room, Fred de Cordova and Ed McMahon rushed after him, Fred's voice sharp with demands for an explanation. "We need to know what happened. We have 15 minutes to air, and the king looks like he's seen a ghost." Fred's executive panic was evident, driven by the cold fear of massive financial loss and a professional crisis erupting just minutes before airtime. But Doc Severinsen, having just placed his trumpet carefully back on its stand, moved with the sudden, quiet authority of a man who understood the true nature of the crisis, a crisis rooted in shared private history. Doc blocked the entryway with his wide, velvet-clad frame, asserting a silent control over the star's personal space that instantly astonished Fred. "He needs 5 minutes alone," Doc stated, his voice low and firm, his tone brooking no argument. "He just had feedback on his monitors. It jarred him. I'm going in." Doc fabricated the excuse of a sound issue to deflect Fred's professional inquiries, knowing that the real trauma was emotional, not technical. Fred was aghast. "You're going in? Doc, you're the band leader. I'm the executive producer. You don't just decide the host needs 5 minutes or that you get priority access." Fred's authority felt violently challenged, a sacred boundary in the production hierarchy instantly violated. "I just did, Fred," Doc countered, meeting the producer's furious gaze with absolute calmness. "He needs a minute to settle the sound. I'll handle it." Doc's defiance was an uncharacteristic act of loyalty and assertiveness, the first time anyone had ever dared to challenge the raw authority of the star's handlers. Fred and Ed were left helpless and furious outside, their authority neutralized by the quiet, unshakable will of the band leader. Doc turned, opened the heavy steel-reinforced door, slipped inside, and locked it behind him. The heavy click sound isolating Johnny from the crushing pressure of the outside world. Doc found Carson slumped deep on the plush velvet couch, his famous tuxedo jacket rumpled and pushed up around his shoulders. The cheap harmonica was still clutched tightly in his hand, a tiny, terrible piece of evidence linking the King of Late Night to his most profound vulnerability. Johnny was physically shaking, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps, He looked less like the untouchable king of late night and more like the panicked young man who had faced humiliation 27 years prior in that Iowa alley. Doc didn't rush him. He didn't ask what happened or offer empty platitudes. He simply sat in a chair opposite the couch, removing his signature, oversized sunglasses, and acknowledging the shared devastating memory without uttering a single word. Doc knew that this moment demanded a witness, not a conversation, a silent partner who understood the depth of the wound without needing a verbal explanation. The quiet, shared silence eventually did what Fred's frantic commands could not. Johnny slowly opened his hand, his fingers relaxing their grip on the relic. The harmonica fell silently onto the rug. His voice, when it finally came, was a raspy, vulnerable whisper, stripped of all practiced charm. "That terrible thing," Johnny whispered, his eyes still haunted. "It brings it all back, Doc. That Iowa alley, Grimes's review, the feeling that I was cheap, that I'd never be good enough." He finally confessed the wound that had defined his career. "The harmonica, it was the last gift my father gave me. He told me to always be humble. When Grimes called the routine cheap Midwest sentimentality, it was like he was telling me my father was wrong, that his whole life was wrong. I spent 2 decades proving I wasn't cheap. But the fear never left. It was the raw confession of Carson's deepest fear, that his success was just an illusion built on shaky ground, and that one day the world would laugh at his vulnerability again, confirming the critics' verdict." Doc listened, his eyes steady, recognizing the depth of the trauma that the public had never been allowed to see. Doc moved slowly, picked up the harmonica, and pocketed it, taking the burden, the symbol of his friend's greatest shame, away. The crisis had been averted for now, but the internal wound was still fresh and required a permanent solution, a vow only Doc could deliver. Doc Severinsen didn't offer pity or advice. He offered a shield, a silent contract of absolute professional and personal protection that would bind the king and the bandleader for the rest of their careers. Doc reached into the pocket of his crimson jacket, pulled out a small, crumpled cue card, and smoothed it against his knee with meticulous care. It wasn't one of the pristine cue cards prepared for the monologue. This one was old, torn, and had belonged to the long-forgotten show in Des Moines 27 years earlier, a physical reminder of their shared struggle. "You know what the real failure was that night, John?" Doc asked, using the familiar private name reserved for moments outside the spotlight. "It wasn't the review, and it wasn't your father. It was that you let that piece of paper, that mean opinion from one miserable man, become the only thing you believed about yourself for 20 years. Johnny looked up, his eyes meeting Doc's. He saw not the band leader, but the young musician who had shared the freezing alley with him, the witness who knew the truth of his talent. "I was there, John," Doc continued, his voice a quiet, insistent melody, refusing to let his friend dwell in the past. "I saw the performance before that little piece of tin choked on you. I saw the raw talent, I saw the incredible drive, and I saw the humiliation. You spent 20 years building this kingdom to prove that the critic was wrong, but by giving that fear power, you let his words become the rule." Doc's voice held the weight of shared experience, giving him the authority to challenge the host's lifelong narrative of guilt. Doc took a pen from his breast pocket and deliberately, carefully wrote 12 words on the back of the crumpled card. He placed the card firmly in Johnny's hand, closing the star's fingers around it, replacing the harmonica with the new, powerful text, a definitive counter-narrative to the critic's harsh judgment. "This is your new rule," Doc stated, his gaze unshakable. "The audience always waits. The talent never breaks. We are here for you, now and always." The 12 words weren't a sentiment. They were a code, a command, a lifeline, and an unwritten vow. Doc had deliberately focused the promise on the present moment, on the physical action of the show, making it a tangible, professional anchor. He was telling Johnny that his greatest asset was not his cynicism or his control, but the unwavering loyalty of the people around him. "Anytime you feel that ice coming back," Doc said, gesturing to the area where Johnny had frozen, "anytime you hear Grimes whispering in the wings, you look at me. And I will play the cue, and I will play those 12 words. The audience always waits. The talent never breaks. We are here for you, now and always. Johnny stared at the card. The familiar pressure of the pen on the card, the specific rhythm of the 12 words, replaced the awful memory of the failed joke. It was a transfer of emotional weight. The trauma was now replaced by a protective command. It was the absolute guarantee of protection that allowed the king of late night to finally put the shame of Iowa back into its vault. Johnny carefully folded the card and placed it into his innermost pocket closest to his heart. The shared secret, the moment of absolute vulnerability, had cemented their bond beyond any professional contract. They weren't just colleagues, they were co-conspirators in the preservation of a legend. The crisis was averted, but the true work, healing the 27-year-old wound, had just begun. That 12-word vow became their secret code of trust. Do you have a special phrase or code that binds you to a friend or colleague? Drop a comment below and share your code of loyalty. The stage manager's 5-minute call sliced through the silence, signaling the end of the therapeutic session and demanding the return of the king. The crisis was concealed, but the emotional dynamic between Johnny and Doc had changed forever. When the door to the dressing room finally opened, Fred de Cordova nearly lunged forward, his face etched with a desperate blend of anxiety and professional fury over the unexplained delay. Fred tried to intercept Johnny, demanding assurances that the host was ready, but Johnny simply walked straight past him, his gaze fixed on a distant point, his composure a fragile, visible shell over the trauma he had just confessed. Johnny's usual pre-show routine, a quick chat with Ed, a final glance at the cue cards, was discarded. He moved with the focused determination of a man walking a tightrope, every step careful, every movement measured. He settled behind his desk, noticeably paler than usual, but with the familiar, penetrating blue gaze back in his eyes. Doc Severinsen was already at the bandstand, his silver trumpet held low, watching. Ed McMahon, trying to cover the lingering tension, leaned over. "Rough rehearsal, pal. Did Doc fix your monitor problem?" Johnny didn't answer Ed. He didn't need to. He placed his hands flat on the desk, took one deep, visible breath, and gave Doc a single, subtle, unscripted head nod, the signal to begin. Doc raised his trumpet, and instead of the usual brassy fanfare, he played a distinct, low, deep trumpet note, a sound that resonated with quiet authority. It was the musical signature of the 12-word vow, a note only he and Johnny would ever recognize as a declaration of absolute support. The effect on the audience, who had finally been let into the studio and were now roaring with applause, was negligible, but the entire crew noticed the unusual musical cue. Fred, watching in the booth, frowned, wondering why the fanfare was so muted. Johnny began the monologue. He was slightly off his game, his timing a fraction of a second slower than his usual laser precision. He paused awkwardly after one setup, and for a terrifying second, the memory of the collapse flickered across the stage. The silence stretched. Doc saw it. He immediately played a short, sharp, commanding 3-note phrase, the musical embodiment of the code. The talent never breaks. Johnny's eyes snapped toward the bandstand, catching Doc's unshakable gaze. The signal worked. Johnny visibly straightened, the color rushing back to his face. He delivered the punchline, and the audience erupted in laughter. Every time Johnny felt the tremor of self-doubt creeping in, he would subtly adjust his tie, or more tellingly, touch the inner pocket of his tuxedo where the crumpled cue card lay, the exact location of their sacred code. Doc would immediately drop a soft, specific note or phrase that reminded him of their shared secret. The audience sensed the tension but was confused, perhaps thinking the odd musical cues were part of a new, quirky performance element. They never knew they were witnessing an act of continuous, heroic salvage. The broadcast continued, saved not by the show's machinery, but by the raw, improvised loyalty of a friend. Johnny had survived the broadcast, proving he could return to the throne. But the price of his survival was now known, and the true cost of their deep friendship was about to be paid in private. The taping was finally over. The audience noise had faded, and the high-stakes terror of the breakdown was replaced by the quiet, settling order of a successful broadcast. Doc Severinsen, alone on the stage, began the intimate, familiar ritual of packing his magnificent silver trumpet. Doc was carefully placing his instrument into its custom leather case, a routine he had performed thousands of times when his fingers brushed against something foreign inside the velvet lining, a small velvet bag that did not belong there. He paused, instantly recognizing the velvety texture as the kind used for fine jewelry or expensive instruments. He looked around the now empty stage, but only the custodial crew was present. He picked up the small bag and pulled the drawstring. Inside was a trumpet, but not his usual silver one. This trumpet was clearly vintage, with an exquisite, subtle gold patina polished to a mirror sheen. Doc recognized it instantly. A custom-engraved, extremely rare Selmer-balanced model, the very instrument he had dreamed of owning since his earliest days as a struggling musician. He had searched for that specific model for decades, the cost always placing it squarely outside his reach. It was an instrument worth more than the down payment on a modest home. Doc carefully lifted the trumpet out, his hands moving with reverence. Attached to one of the valve slides with a thin gold thread was a tiny, folded piece of paper. The paper was clean, crisp, and bore the unmistakable, perfect flowing script of Johnny Carson's handwriting. Doc unfolded the note. It had no signature, no greeting, and no financial details. It simply contained a 2-line message. "We are here for you, now and always. The audience always waits." The 12 words, the secret code, the emotional weight of the anonymous, perfectly tailored gift hit Doc with the force of a physical blow. Johnny hadn't offered a check or a public acknowledgement, which would have been crass, and violated Doc's fiercely guarded professional pride. Instead, he had given the one thing Doc truly coveted, framing the enormous expense as a shared, private recognition of their bond and Doc's heroic action. The note confirmed everything. The secret was safe, the collapse was contained, and the debt for saving the show and Carson's dignity had been paid, not in currency, but in a priceless symbol of appreciation. Doc held the vintage trumpet, its cool weight a physical representation of the king's silent gratitude. This was Johnny's way of saying, "You were there for me in the alley in Iowa, and you were there for me on the stage tonight. You protected my greatest weakness, and in return, I will honor your deepest wish." Doc looked toward Johnny's now darkened dressing room door. He didn't thank him aloud, he couldn't. Instead, he raised the beautiful Selmer trumpet to his lips, and softly, privately, played a perfect, deep, melodious version of the 12-word theme he had improvised just hours earlier. The notes hung in the vast, empty studio, a perfect, silent conversation between two men who understood that the most powerful currency in Hollywood was loyalty, not fame. The thunderous applause had finally subsided. The tears had been wiped, and the famous 30-year run of The Tonight Show was ticking down to its final silent moments. Johnny Carson, standing alone at his desk in 1992, shared a final, profound moment with the only man who knew the true cost of the crown. The air in Studio One was heavy with nostalgia, saturated with the quiet finality of a television era coming to a dignified close. As the final segment wrapped and the cameras held tight on Johnny, the host turned to the bandstand, his famous blue eyes catching Doc Severinsen's gaze. Doc, standing ready with the vintage Selmer balanced model, the trumpet Johnny had secretly gifted him years earlier, raised his instrument. He didn't play the usual triumphant farewell. Instead, with a sudden, powerful commitment, Doc launched into the exact chaotic, improvised piece he had played years ago to cover Johnny's panic attack during rehearsal. The bizarre, jazzy onslaught that followed, the angular notes, the sudden dissonance, the strange, glorious sound of controlled musical mayhem, was entirely unexpected. The audience was confused, but the crew, who remembered the bizarre technical glitch that day, exchanged knowing glances. This time, however, the chaotic notes were intentional, played as a final, powerful, hidden tribute. Doc was playing the sound of a show being saved by absolute loyalty. Johnny stood perfectly still, watching. He recognized the theme instantly, recognizing the sound of his own deepest vulnerability being publicly acknowledged and yet eternally protected. A genuine, unscripted smile spread across Carson's face, a look of profound gratitude that transcended the formality of the set. Doc sustained the performance for exactly 30 seconds, ending abruptly on the deep, sustained trumpet note, the musical signature of the 12-word vow. Doc lowered the golden trumpet. Johnny tilted his head slightly, a silent, final acknowledgement of the code. The audience always waits. The talent never breaks. We are here for you, now and always. They shared a final, knowing, silent moment across the distance of the stage, a powerful piece of nonverbal history that spanned decades and humiliation. The audience never understood the significance of the chaotic music, but they understood the depth of the bond they were witnessing. The cameras faded to black, the final broadcast was over, and the show was history. The story concludes by emphasizing the secret, powerful legacy of the 12-word vow, the true, untold story of the king of late night. The ultimate, most lasting legacy of Johnny Carson wasn't the laughter or the fame, but the quiet, unshakable loyalty of the man who stood by his side, ready to play a strange, glorious song to save his friend's dignity. That shared, silent vow is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't just about control, but about having a friend who knows your deepest weakness. If this story about Doc and Johnny's unshakable loyalty moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more hidden chapters from Hollywood's golden age. If this story of private kindness moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that the most powerful people are the ones who protect the unseen.